Weeks after Mark Bennett kept the house, the car, and custody of our two children, I carried my father's sewing machine into the basement of Grace Hill Church and hemmed 12 school uniforms for $3 each. $36. That was all I made that morning. Not enough for rent, not enough for a used car, not enough to make a judge say, yes, this woman can give her children a stable home. But it was the first money I had earned in my own name after 12 years of being told I did not need one.
9 months later, that machine would sit on a folding table in front of a school committee while Mark watched from the back of the room. He had spent more than a year making every important document carry his name instead of mine: the mortgage, the savings, the insurance, the car title, emergency contact forms at school. Even the grocery credit card had quietly become his account.
On paper, I looked like a woman who had contributed almost nothing. That was the wound I did not know how to explain.
Because I had been there for every fever, every lunchbox, every parent-teacher meeting, every torn pair of school pants. I knew which sock bothered Noah's ankle. I knew Emily stopped talking when she was hurt, not when she was fine. I knew how to stretch one pack of chicken into 3 meals.
But none of that had a signature line. None of that showed up in court. Mark understood documents. He understood how to move slowly. He never shouted when he wanted control. He said, it's easier if I handle the accounts, and the refinance works better with one borrower, and you focus on the kids, I'll take care of the rest. I believed him because that is what trust looks like before you realize it has been used against you. The day the papers came, he placed the envelope on the kitchen counter while I was rinsing rice for dinner. I remember the water running over my hands. I remember reading my own life in language that made me sound like a guest in it. No independent income. No vehicle in her name. No verified housing. Limited recent employment history. Primary custody requested by the father due to stability concerns. Stability. That was the word he used after I had spent 12 years keeping everything stable enough for him to build a career on top of it. The temporary order came fast. Mark stayed in the house on Maple Ridge Drive with Emily and Noah. I left with 2 bags of clothes, a shoebox of sewing supplies, and the machine my father had used for 31 years. Mark did not fight me for it. He looked at it sitting in the garage, heavy and gray, and said, you can take that old thing if you want. It's just taking up space. That old thing. My father had taught me on that machine when I was 9. He repaired uniforms, work jackets, choir robes, anything someone needed to fix the world looking less broken than they felt. He used to say, a seam only holds if you do the work where nobody sees it. At first, the machine sat in the corner of Mara's living room, covered with a towel, while I slept on her sofa and tried to answer my children's texts without promises I could not keep. Emily asked if I was coming to her art show. Noah asked if I had a room yet. Then one night, Mara asked me if the machine still worked. I wanted to say no. I wanted to say a sewing machine could not fix a custody order, or put my name back on a deed, or make a bank believe I existed. But I plugged it in anyway. The motor coughed, the needle jumped, the thread snapped twice. Then, after I oiled the parts the way my father used to, it started moving. Not smoothly, not beautifully, but steadily. The next morning, I took in 12 donated school uniforms from the church closet, pants too long, knees torn, waistbands loose, clothes for children who needed them ready before Monday. By noon, I had $36 in an envelope and a list of names written in a notebook. I did not know yet that those names would become customers, that the notebook would become records, that the records would become evidence, that the evidence would become the first thing Mark could not explain away. All I knew was this: he had taken everything that had a title, a deed, an account number, or a signature. And he had left me the one thing he never thought was worth naming. He should have looked closer. For a long time, I thought a quiet house meant a healthy one. Our house on Maple Ridge Drive looked peaceful from the sidewalk. White trim, 2 maple trees, a basketball hoop over the garage where Noah played until the driveway was covered with chalk marks. In the kitchen window, Emily kept herbs and pretended she was on a cooking show. From the outside, we looked like a family that had figured things out. Mark left for work at 7:15 every morning in a pressed shirt and dark coat. He worked as a finance manager at a local credit union, the kind of job that made people trust him before he finished a sentence. He knew numbers. He knew paperwork. I was the one who made the house run. I packed lunches, signed field trip forms, remembered which teacher preferred email, and which one still sent paper notes home. I knew Noah needed extra socks after basketball. I knew Emily would say she was fine for 2 days before admitting someone at school had hurt her feelings. Mark called that being good with the kids. I called it my life. At first, I did not mind that his name was on more things than mine. When Emily was born, childcare would have eaten most of my paycheck, and Mark said it made sense for me to stay home. "You focus on her," he said. "I'll handle the rest." That was how it started. Not with a threat, not with a locked door, just one reasonable sentence after another.
When Noah came along, Mark suggested combining the accounts. Later, when the house was refinanced, he said the new rate worked better with one borrower. He put the papers on the kitchen counter while I was making spaghetti.
"Just the last 2 pages," he said. "It saves us money." I signed where he pointed. I wish I could say I felt something wrong, but I didn't. I trusted my husband. I trusted the father of my children. I trusted the man who told everyone he could not do half of what he did without me. Except when it mattered, he rarely said my name. At dinner parties, I cooked for his coworkers. They complimented the food, and Mark smiled like we had done it together. "Threw together a little dinner," he would say. That word covered a lot. It covered the 6 hours I spent in the kitchen. It covered the dishes I washed after everyone left. It covered the table runners I hemmed for the church fundraiser. People thanked Mark for being generous with our time. He accepted it easily. My father would have noticed that. Frank Miller had been a tailor most of his life, mostly uniforms and work jackets, clothes people needed to face the world with dignity. In his shop, he taught me to check the inside of a seam before admiring the outside. "A seam only holds if you do the work where nobody sees it," he used to say. After he died, I kept his old sewing machine in our garage. It was heavy, gray, and scratched along the side where his wedding ring had tapped the metal for 30 years. Mark never yelled about it. He just sighed whenever he had to walk around it. "You know we could use that space," he said once. Another time, he called it sentimental clutter. I should have heard the warning in that. Mark respected things with titles, values, account numbers, signatures. A machine that carried only memory meant nothing to him. Still, life kept moving. There were dentist appointments, school concerts, grocery lists, and nights when Mark came home late and said he had already eaten. There were envelopes he opened in his office and passwords changed because, according to him, the bank required updates. There were forms from school he filled out before I saw them because he said he was saving me time. Small things. So small, I stepped over them. Near the end, he started taking the kids to school more often. He said it helped me rest. He attended parent meetings alone if I had errands. He told me not to worry about the insurance renewal, the credit card replacement, the mortgage folder, the online banking notice. I took care of it, he said. And I believed that meant we were safe. I did not know he was building a version of our family where he looked like the stable one, and I looked like a woman who helped around the house. I did not know my name was disappearing one document at a time. I only knew that every night I set 4 plates on the table. And for a while, I thought that meant I belonged there. The first week on Mara's sofa, I kept waiting for one clear explanation. I thought there had to be a mistake somewhere, a missing form, a misunderstanding, a clerk who had typed the wrong thing, because the alternative was too hard to hold. The alternative was that my husband had known exactly what he was doing. Mara gave me the living room without making a speech. She worked mornings at the library and left coffee before she went. My father's sewing machines sat near the front window under an old bath towel, too heavy to move again and too familiar to ignore. I slept 3 feet away from it. Some nights I heard my phone buzz and stared at the ceiling until it stopped. Emily texted first. "Are you coming to my art show?" Then Noah. "Dad says you don't have a room yet." I typed answers and deleted them. I could not promise a room. I could not promise a date. I could not promise I would be at the next hearing with anything better than the empty hands Mark had described in court. On the 4th morning, I called the bank to ask about the savings account. I wanted to know if there was enough left for a deposit. The woman on the phone was polite. That almost made it worse. She said I was not listed on that account. It had been our joint savings. Birthday checks went there. Tax refunds went there. Emergency money went there. She asked if I had another account number. I did not.
Then I remembered a night almost a year earlier. Mark had come home with a folder and said the bank was moving accounts to a new system. He needed my signature on 2 pages.
I had been helping Noah glue cardboard planets to a science project. I signed between Mars and Jupiter. That memory did not feel small anymore. 2 days later, I tried to get added to Mara's car insurance so I could borrow her car. The agent asked for my policy history. When I called our old insurer, they told me I had been removed months before. Removed. That was the word. I remembered Mark standing by the garage door, saying the renewal had been expensive and he had cleaned up the policy. I had thanked him. The third piece came from the school office. I went in to make sure the teachers had my number. The secretary turned the monitor slightly away and said Mark was listed as the primary parent for school communications. I said, "I'm their mother." She lowered her voice and said, "I know." Mark had updated the forms in February, 3 months before the papers were served. I walked out of the school and stood beside the flagpole until my hands stopped shaking. Savings account, insurance policy, school contact forms. Then the refinance papers. Then the credit card that had stopped working in the grocery store while Mark said there had been fraud. Then the way he started taking the kids to school more often, saying I needed rest. None of it had looked cruel when it happened. That was the part that scared me most. Each piece had worn the costume of convenience. Each one had sounded like care. By the end of that week, I had a notebook open on Mara's coffee table. On the left side, I wrote dates. On the right side, I wrote what changed. I did not write feelings. If I started writing feelings, I would not stop. Mara sat across from me and said, "Laura, this is a pattern." I wanted to argue. I wanted to protect the version of myself who had trusted him. But the list was sitting between us, and the list did not care what I wanted. That night, I pulled the towel off my father's sewing machine. Dust sat along the wheel. A strip of blue thread was still caught near the needle. Mara asked if it worked. "I don't know," I said. But I was afraid it would. If the machine started, then I would have to start too. The motor coughed when I plugged it in. The needle jumped, the thread snapped twice. I oiled the parts the way my father had taught me. Then the machine began to move. The next morning, Pastor Helen let me use a corner of the church basement. Donated uniforms were piled in plastic bins. Pants too long, knees torn, waistbands loose. I hemmed 12 pieces that day. $36. I wrote every name in the notebook, every item, every dollar. It was not enough to bring my children home. But it was the first page Mark had not written for me. The first thing Simone Hart told me was not comforting. She did not look at my notebook, pat my hand, and say everything would be fine. She was 32, maybe 33, with tired eyes and case folders on her desk. She read my timeline twice. Then she said, "Laura, this helps, but it does not fix everything." I nodded like I understood, even though part of me had walked into that legal aid office, hoping one clean list would make the court see what Mark had done. The savings account, the insurance policy, the school forms, the refinance papers I had signed while Noah's science project dried on the kitchen table. Simone tapped the page with her pen. "What you have is a pattern," she said, "but custody is not decided by who hurt you most. The court will want to know what your life looks like now." Now. That word was heavier than all the papers in my folder. Now I slept on Mara's sofa. Now my income was $36 here, $48 there, folded into envelopes. Now my children had a bedroom at Mark's house, and a mother who could only meet them at the library twice a week. I wanted to tell Simone that none of that was fair. Instead, I asked, "What do I do?" She gave me 4 instructions. Keep records of every dollar. Get a written agreement for the church basement. Find housing with my name on the lease. Communicate with Mark only in writing. No speeches, she said. No angry calls. No social media posts. No trying to make him admit what he did. Build the file. So that is what I did.
Pastor Helen wrote a letter saying I could use the basement 3 mornings a week and paid $25 every Friday. Ruth Ann, a retired bookkeeper, gave me a receipt book and taught me how to separate money for supplies, rent, and taxes.
If someone calls this a hobby, Ruth Ann said, make the paperwork disagree.
By the 6th week, I was repairing uniforms for parents I barely knew. Pants, skirts, loose waistbands, broken zippers. I charged $6 for hems, 4 for patches, 10 for zippers. Every name went into the notebook. Every payment went into a small checking account under my name.
Not Mrs. Mark Bennett.
Laura Miller Bennett.
The Miller mattered to me. That was my father's name.
The first real opportunity came from Dana Ortiz, a mother from the school's uniform closet. She brought 2 bins filled with donated clothes that did not fit the children who needed them. 40 pieces, 2 weeks, 1 check if I finished on time.
I was afraid to say yes. Then I thought about Simone's words, build the file. I said yes.
For 14 days, I worked before sunrise and after dinner. The machine jammed twice, my back ached, I kept bandages beside the thread. Mr. Calvin Reed, a retired repairman, adjusted the tension and told me my father had taken good care of that machine.
I almost cried when he said that.
On day 9, the school paused the order.
Dana called carefully. Mark had emailed the administrator. He said I was in an active custody dispute. He said he was concerned I was using the uniform program to create an image of stability. He asked whether the school had verified my business.
For 10 minutes, I sat on the basement floor and stared at the bins.
The old me would have called him. The old me would have begged him to stop. The old me would have tried to explain that those uniforms were not a trick. They were work.
Instead, I called Simone. She told me to send documents, not feelings. So I sent the church agreement, my price sheet, receipts, and a note saying I had no contact with students and only handled donated clothing through the parent coordinator. The school restarted the order the next morning.
Mark called that night.
I did not answer. He texted, "You know this little sewing thing does not make you stable." My hands shook when I read it, but I did not reply. I printed the message and put it behind his email to the school. One page did not prove everything, but one page after another was beginning to show exactly what he was trying to do. On the last day, I delivered 40 finished uniforms in clear bags. Dana handed me a check and a letter from the school thanking me for professional work. I sat in Mara's parked car and held that letter against my chest. It was not justice. Not yet.
But for the first time, I had a piece of paper Mark had not written for me. The hearing did not feel like the kind of moment people imagine.
There was no dramatic speech. No one gasped. No one stood up and said Mark had been wrong. It was just a small courtroom with tired chairs, fluorescent lights, and a clock that clicked too loudly above the judge's bench. Mark sat across the aisle in a navy suit. He looked calm. His attorney spoke first and used the word Mark had been using for months. Stability. He said Mark had the house. Mark had a steady income. Mark had bedrooms for both children and a car in the driveway. He said, my sewing work was new, unpredictable, and not enough to replace the structure the children already had. I listened with my hands folded on the table. The old me would have wanted to interrupt. I would have wanted to explain that I had packed lunches and kept those children steady long before Mark ever used the word in court. But Simone had told me, let the file speak.
So I sat still.
Then she opened the folder.
She did not make me sound like a hero. She made me sound real. A lease with my name on it. 4 months of bank deposits. Receipt books. The church basement agreement. The school uniform check.
Then came Mark's email to the school. Simone read the part where he said I was using donated uniforms to manufacture stability. She read his text saying my little sewing thing did not make me stable. She did not raise her voice. The judge looked at Mark and asked why he had contacted the school about work that had nothing to do with the children's safety. Mark said he was concerned. The judge asked what danger there was in me hemming donated pants. Mark did not have a clean answer. That was the first time I saw it. Not fear, not regret. Just the small pause of a man whose words no longer landed where he expected them to. The decision came 20 minutes later.
I did not get everything back. The judge did not hand me full custody and send Mark out ashamed. That is not how court worked that day.
But the order changed. I was granted alternating weekends overnight, 2 weekday dinners, and direct access to school records. Communication had to go through a parenting app. Mark was instructed not to contact anyone connected to my work unless it directly involved the children. There would be another review in 90 days. 90 days. It sounded small to anyone who had not been counting hours with their children. To me, it sounded like a door opening far enough for light to come through. The first weekend, Emily and Noah stayed at my apartment. I cleaned for 2 days. The place was still too small. The mattresses did not match. The kitchen table folded down from the wall, and the curtains were made from discount fabric.
But when Noah dropped his backpack by the door, he did not look around like it was temporary.
He said, "Where do I sleep?"
I pointed to the mattress by the window.
He smiled. Emily stood beside my sewing machine and ran her fingers over the scratches in the metal. "This was Grandpa Frank's?"
I nodded.
"You fixed uniforms too?" Uniforms, jackets, anything people needed to feel ready. She looked at me and said, "So you're doing what he did." I had spent months trying to prove I was more than what Mark put on paper. My daughter said it like it had always been obvious.
Mark did not disappear after that. He still argued through the app. He still used polite words like reasonable when he meant control. But something in me had changed. I stopped answering fear with explanations. When he called outside the app, I let it ring. When he wrote something meant to make me feel small, I saved it and replied only about the children. I went to work.
3 months later, the school committee approved Miller Stitch and Mend as a small vendor for the uniform closet. It was not a big contract. It did not make me rich. It did not erase what Mark had done.
But it had my name on it.
My father used to say a seam only holds if you do the work where nobody sees it. For a long time, I thought that meant my work did not matter because no one saw it. I know better now. The hidden work is often the strongest part. So if someone spends years making you disappear from every document they can touch, do you keep begging them to see you? Or do you start building a life that no longer needs their signature to be real?